Hello, this is Carl Irwin with a Blender tutorial for a new pack that I have uploaded to Blendswap. It is kind of an interesting, somewhat innovative idea in use of OpenGL rendering in Blender. And I'd like to first point to it so that you can go find this blend file so that you can use it if you're interested in something like this. You can find it at the following shortened link. bit.ly/ capital Z, capital W, capital K, UTP. This is the shortened link. Or you can go to blendswap.com and just search for GLOptics. GLOptics, and you can find this file there. Just to show you exactly what the file does, it takes a 16:9 input video, and you can use this rig in the viewport using GLSL shading and OpenGL rendering, and convert a 16:9 input video, which is a standard widescreen video, to a 2.351 output, which is an anamorphic lens aspect ratio. So you can see here I have actually, let me leave full screen here. You can see the these titles here indicating what kind of distortion is going on. But you can see these examples. There's 4 presets. The first one is a letterbox preset. You can see here the squares on the input to the output are square all the way around. There's no lens distortion whatsoever. And this is simply as if you were taking applying an overlay of the black boxes on top and bottom to cut down your 16:9 video and crop it to a 2.35:1. However, this is the actual output size. There's not a letterbox overlay on the output. It outputs at the new aspect ratio. Another version here is a very slight distortion, and you can see here, if you were to count the boxes, I believe you have in the center 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, almost 11 boxes in the center. Here, if you count this center on this distortion, you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then a little bit of the top and bottom there, so about 11 and a half. And what's happening here is that the original input is being distorted slightly, so that you get a little bit more on the interior and the inside of the frame, a little bit less, and it creates this kind of a distortion, a lens distortion. It sort of fakes this distortion as what you would get with a real anamorphic lens. Again, this is a cropping that's going on, so you're losing a little bit on the top and bottom, but here on this version you get a little bit more because it distorts. This is a little bit more drastic. I call it a panoramic, and again, it is a crop, so you're not really getting a wider view, but if you had your camera pushed back a bit from your subject, you could sort of emulate or simulate a panoramic type lens, where it would seem that things that are on the objects that are on the outside peripheral would be a little bit closer and more distorted. And here on the interior, you're getting quite a bit. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 and some units on the interior here. So quite a bit more. In fact, this is almost the entire range on the y-axis of the original 16:9 video. And then over here is what I call a fisheye sort of distortion, and it's kind of the converse of the anamorphic and the panoramic, where you're getting quite a bit less in the center, but quite a bit more on the outside edge, and you can see this inverted sort of distortion that's going on here. So 4 different presets to play with, kind of a generic letterboxing, an anamorphic lens distortion, which is not entirely very perceivable, but you would notice in a few instances that you would use in certain types of video, a panoramic, which would be considerably more noticeable, and then this fisheye, which would be a considerably more obvious distortion and kind of converse from the other two. Anyway, this is what it accomplishes. You can see some example video, and before I show you the video, I'll just show you where I got my test video from. This is the Blendswap page. This is what the icon looks like for the collection, and you can download it here. And I used a some footage from this place, HollywoodCameraWork.us. Some of you may have been there before. They have green screen footage and some tracking footage and some general footage that you can use, stock footage, for free. It doesn't cost anything, just to play around with. So part of the licensing agreement of that free footage is that you point back to the site. So I just wanted to show this to you very quickly if you want to get some footage to play around with for multiple things in Blender or in any compositing software. To go back here, this is the video. You can see this sets up the different types of distortion, and then this is an example of the video output. And you can see it playing back. I'll pause for a second. And you can kind of see the differences here. If I move a little bit quicker through the timeline, you can see how this distortion stands out. So in the bottom right, you see this is really just a letterbox overlay. It's not an overlay, it's a cropping. It's a letterbox crop. You can see what that looks like. Nothing's really distorted at all. If you go up here to the anamorphic one, the very light distortion, you can see that it looks very similar to the letterbox, particularly in the center of the screen. The ratios are pretty similar to what they ought to be. And the further you get to the outside, the more distortion that you can see. The panoramic one is quite a bit more excessive, and you can see how much more you gain in the center of the screen with this distortion, quite a bit more in the margins in the top and bottom. And then, of course, the fisheye one down here, where you lose quite a bit in the center, you gain a lot more on the outside, and it creates quite a bit more of a distortion effect, a lens distortion effect. So, especially if you have objects, such as in this footage with this lady walking towards the truck, she's on the left side, and then she ends up on the right side of the screen, and there's a lot going on in Z space. You're coming closer to the truck, and she's also moving closer to the camera in Z space. You can really see this distortion play out as the camera moves through the scene. So this is essentially what the rig does. Now, it does a few other things too. It has some color grading presets in it that I'll show you. Again, this is going to be rendered in OpenGL. And there's also some lens grit and some vignette controls. So this is using one of the basic color grading presets, one of the basic vignette presets, and also one of the basic film grain presets. So let's close this out, and we will jump into the blend file. So if you look, once you open up the zip file, you'll unpack it to a separate folder, and there are some assets in the folder that need to be with the original file, because there's a couple of noise videos, 5-frame videos, that will need to be used inside of the Blender file, so they need to be in proximity to that file. Also, there are some other assets that are packaged into the blend file. They're packed in, but I also gave them to you separate so that you could use them. Video and image sequences do not pack into blend files as of now. They still are called upon from the outside, so that's why it's important that your original file, stay packaged and placed with these assets. So let's open up the file and see what it looks like. When you first open up the file, you will see that there is a scene with some instructions on it. This is set up much like my GL lens flare, GL flare pack, where there's a scene here with some instructions. So, post-production optical effects pack. It's got my name on it, and it does indicate the credit is not required for use. You can use this any way that you choose. You don't need to credit back to me. I know that can be a hassle sometimes to be crediting everything that you use, all these free things that you get. So I'm just happy if you use it. Instructions. Use the lens rig scene, which is the next scene here, to mesh deform a 16:9 aspect ratio video and convert it to a simulated 2.35 to 1 anamorphic aspect ratio. So this is a simulation. I don't claim this to be accurate. It's just a simulation. We're looking for something that looks realistic, but it is not necessarily actual. So a couple of steps here. First, you're going to place your input 16:9 video in the next available texture slot in the video input material. So really the only material that you have to use, you're going to place your video into the next texture slot. I will show you what that means in a minute. Be sure to set the correct number of frames in the texture settings. You want to make sure that the frames amount is correct. And also you need to set the mapping to UV. show you what that means in a minute. If you don't set your mapping to UV, it won't distort properly. Then you will enable the render button in the outliner. This is the outline over here for the mesh deform setting that you want to use. So the mesh deform settings are 4 objects, 4 deformed planes. The first one is letterbox, which will crop kind of straight on without distortion. Anamorphic, which is the default one that's up. You'll see in a minute. The panoramic and the fisheye. You want to enable only one of these. You don't want them all to be on. Be sure that only one is enabled, otherwise it won't quite work. Third step, route your material with the node editor, and this is optional, you don't have to do this, but there is a node setup here you'll see on the right hand node editing window that's open by default to place an additional vignette, a grain overlay, film grain overlay, and a color grading scheme. And there's 12 presets of color grading to use. This is all optional. And you can also use a demo image that's in there. I'll show you that in a moment to test some of these things and to audition these node effects. Set your output video settings, so you'll want to change your render settings to the correct frame rate. I'll talk a bit about that as well, what you should do for that. And you want to also make sure that you're using a proper aspect ratio output so that you're getting 2.35 to 1, and that's actually indicated in the scene, as you'll see in a moment. Then you render using the OpenGL Video Render button, which is actually this button right here. So these are the OpenGL render buttons. You're not going to use the Blender internal render engine, and we're not using cycles. We're using OpenGL because we want this to work very quickly. Okay, so you'll use the OpenGL render buttons, and that's it. And you'll get your output based on your output settings. So let's take a look at what the scene looks like. So if we jump over to the lens rig, which is the scene that we'll be using, you'll see that I have a node set up. We'll get to that in a second. And you can see this deformed mesh with this image here to just kind of indicate what the deformation looks like. And also it has some text here indicating what your output resolution should be for high definition. These are not 4K resolutions, these are just standard HD. I'm not sure what the 4K resolution should be. You can check that out, look that up on Google or something, and that should work as well if you're working in that kind of size, resolution of film. I don't, so this is about as far as I go. 1280 by 544, that's the default we're going to use, or you can do the 1080p version, which is 1920 by 820, and you'll want to set that over here in your render output. Now, to hit these steps, before I hit the steps and go through the process, I want to explain a few things. Blender has a compositor. It has a very good compositor, node compositor, very powerful. It's also incredibly slow. Using the compositor is like watching paint dry. It's much slower than most other compositors. It does not have real-time playback by any stretch of the imagination. Even with a fast video card, it does not play back in real time. Blender also has the video sequence editor, which is a compositor as well. It's a video editor, but it is also a compositor. You can do compositing in the video sequence editor. It plays back closer to real time, but it also has some limitations in terms of compositing. There are other compositors, however. Let me explain. When using GLSL shading mode, this viewport is a compositor. You can have multiple objects in here, and they will be composited together, layered together in the view from which they are in the camera. You can use alpha transparent planes as if they're placed in the proper order, and they're using the right blending modes. There are blending modes for these objects, particularly if you go to the game engine, the Blender game engine. There are some material settings that are blend modes. They are compositing modes. This is a compositor. Also, the material slot, the material setting, is a compositor. If you look under the textures, there are different slots, and they work in order as you add each slot. Each one is a compositing slot with a compositing blend mode. You can see down here for each texture it says blend, and there are these options for the manner in which they are blended together. This is compositing. So this is a compositor. You can also enable, on the material setting, you can enable the node material capabilities. So use shader nodes, and that means that you can utilize the node editor over here. And this is a compositor, just like the compositor, the node compositor space on Blender, if you're just doing compositing. So there's actually multiple compositors. There's the viewport, which is a compositor. There's the material and texture settings, which is a compositor. And then there is the node capabilities, which is a compositor. And all of these things will function, for the most part, except for a few settings, through the OpenGL render output. So you can actually do three-dimensional compositing using OpenGL, and that renders very, very quickly, and that's what I'm doing today. Now, is that what this is intended for? The answer is no, but let me jump on a soapbox very quickly here. Some people may look at this and say, well, this is silly, there's other things that are meant to be used as compositing software or compositing modes in Blender, and this is not one of them. Well, let me say this. Technology, the essence of technology is using something perhaps in a manner other than what it is intended for. That is how technology progresses. You find something that perhaps was intended for one thing, and you find greater use for it, and thereby it evolves into something else, into some other greater use. So this is perfectly acceptable to do this kind of thing and use things for in manners other than what they're intended for. I'm not interested in what something is intended for. I'm interested in what it can do. And you're going to find here that we have some powerful compositing capabilities when we stretch the limitations here of what some of these things were intended for. So off that soapbox now, let me explain how this works. What we're going to do is we're going to go to our material, and this is a material that is shared for all four of these objects, and I'll get to that in a moment. So if you change it in one material, it will change for all of them, which makes it nice and easy. There is a demonstration image that is already plugged in here. All you need to do is enable it, and you can see this single frame. This is just a house. It's a photograph that I took. This is not something that is pirated. This is my own image. This is my in-laws' house in Vermont. Very, very nice kind of place here, very picturesque. And I threw this in here just kind of so that you can use it to see the effects of some of these settings here in the compositing capabilities. So this is the general image. Also, there is a grid image in there so that you can see the distortion capability of each one of these settings. Let me turn on this demo image again, though. This is a demo image so that you can see what the distortion would look like, and also so you can see what these compositing nodes will do. Let's load a video, however. I'm going to grab a video very quickly. Let's go to the next available slot. And again, we are adding layers. This is a compositor. We are compositing layers together. This is going to cover up the ones before it. We could use an add mode. We could use a subtract mode. We can use lots of different blending modes to do this. We're just going to use the mix one for right now. We'll add a new texture. And we're going to select image or movie. By the way, the Blender internal textures will not work in OpenGL. That's one limitation of this. If you're going to use a texture, it's going to need to be something that you create outside or through Blender, and you render it out first, and then you can import it. But we're going to add a texture as image or movie. We will open up an example here. So let me find one. We'll jump up here and find a texture. Let me search around here for a moment. We'll use this test video from Hollywood Camera Work. I'll open the image. Now this is in 30 frames per second, and there's 188 frames. Okay, so let me come down here. We want to make sure our frame setting is correct. So we're going to put in 188. We're going to hit auto refresh, and we're going to make sure our offset is set to 0. And then over here in the output settings, we're going to mark this end for 188 so we have the proper frame output. Then we're going to go over to our render settings, and I'm going to set this frame rate to be 30 frames per second, because that's what the original is. Now, let me mention something here. Film renders at 24 frames per second. Actually, it's 23.98. Video, standard video, it's like what you would see on television, on a news television, for example, is 29.97 or 30 frames per second. 30 is close enough. We kind of round up to that. There is a big discussion about converting 30 frames per second to 24 frames per second to make it look more film-like. I have found that that's not worth it. You can do that by dropping a frame every so often, but you'll find that it makes it very jittery. You can also do some interpolation, which means that it takes some of these frames and mixes them together to create new frames so that it's a little bit smoother. Now that's a very time-sensitive and system resource-heavy endeavor, but that's something you can do, and there's software to do it. Personally, I think it's better to just leave it. If you have a camera that just shoots on 30 frames per second, so what? I find that the color grading that you use is probably more highly effective in making it look film-like than changing the frame rate. Don't worry about that so much. Just use your 30 frames per second video and don't sweat the other stuff. Really not a big deal. If you change this to 24, you will find that it does not actually work the way you intended. It will make the video run slower because it is using fewer frames per second. So this is not a proper way to make your footage look more film-like by just changing it here. You really need to cut frames out, and you can do that using the time tools in the video sequence editor if you really want to. But personally, I found you just leave it alone. And if you think about it, newer movies that are coming out are being put out digitally in 48 frames per second, which is double the typical film frame rate. And that is so that a sharper image and more clarity and less blur, motion blur, can be perceived in the video. And you find that it doesn't make it any less film-like. So it really is the film thing is the film look is more in the grading than anything else. So we're not going to worry about that. So 30 frames per second, there's another soapbox for you. Now, we could render this out as it is. We have it set to, actually we can't render it out as it is. If you notice here that my mapping on my image is incorrect. It is set to generated. I want it to be set to UV. So I'll click on UV, and once that goes into effect, you see how the image moves. We want it to be set properly to the UV map for this deformed mesh. Okay, and you can see now that it deforms, and I can get a little bit more of the interior portion of the frame than what I would have if this was just cropped. Now, let me show you these other deform meshes up here. If I enable the letterbox render ability and I turn off the anamorphic, you can see that this is just a crop. So if I render this out, just one frame, you can see what I end up with. Just a second there for rendering. That's why OpenGL is so great, because it's so quick. So I rendered a full resolution frame, and you can see it's merely cropped. If I go back to my anamorphic, you can see if I render out this frame, you can see the slight distortion. You may not even be able to perceive it, which is probably good, but there's some slight distortion. It's fairly square in the center, but there's distortion towards the outer edges. Okay, and I get more of my interior image, and it looks a little bit more like a lens. If I go back here and I turn it to panoramic, turn off anamorphic, you can see this is very drastic, and I end up getting almost all of my interior frame, and then there's a great deal of distortion on the outside. And I can render this one. You can see what that output looks like. And then there is the last setting, which is a converse setting, which is the fisheye. And if I render this out, you can see what this looks like. So just by making that one material change, I have all four of these presets will take that one material automatically. It makes it nice and easy. So we'll go back to our anamorphic setting here. And in fact, let's get more drastic. We'll do the panoramic one. So this is my panoramic output, and I can play this back in somewhat real time. It's not real time. If this caches, it will be real time and it'll play back very quickly. You can see how quickly it's moving right now. You can really see this distortion taking effect here. Now, this is just a plain, simple output, except for one thing. There is one overlay in here that I have placed into the scene by default that it's always in there. And I'm not sure if you can see it here, but there is a plane set to X-ray out in X-ray transfer mode. That's one of the transfer modes available for the viewport renderer, render engine here. And it is a vignette that fits, if I go back to my camera view, it fits perfectly inside of the camera viewport. This is so that we get a little bit of automatic vignetting going on. It's just a grayscale vignette, very, very subtle, and it adds a little bit more of that optical appearance of an anamorphic lens. Anamorphic lens is going to have some vignetting going on. It is a fall-off effect that is somewhat unavoidable inside of a lens like that that you would get. So I placed that in there. If you want to shut it off, you can do that. You just turn off the renderability over here, and you can see that it disappears in the frame. If I turn it back on, you can watch this light color up here. You'll see that it comes back. Okay, so that is something that is in there by default, and otherwise you're just getting the same color grading that you started with. Now, there is greater functionality here. I have here open a node window, and this is coming through this material, this default material, and this is using node setup, and you can see here that from the material I have it set directly to the output, but I have some of these other preset nodes in here. Let me show you what these are. If I zoom into the first series, we have an additional vignette that will affect the entire frame. So I have a light vignette, a medium vignette, and a heavy vignette. And I'll show you how that works in a moment. The next series is a grain. Sometimes, usually these days, we want our footage to look as clean and clear as possible. But if our goal is to emulate film and an anamorphic type look, an anamorphic lens on film, we may want to add some grain in. So I've created some presets here. What these are using is a 5 frame loop of noise that I have generated and placed into the pack, and there is one version of it, and then there's another version of the same footage that is flipped on the X and Y axis, and one is added and then the other one is subtracted from the image. So there's a light grain, a medium grain, and a heavy grain. By the way, you can change these by clicking on it, and if you hit tab, you can see the nodes that are present. So you can see here I have a grain here and another material here with another grain, and one is added, one is subtracted at a very, very low amount, and then that goes out to the output again. So we'll tab out. So light, medium, and heavy grain. We'll show you what that looks like. Then the last series is 12 presets of color, not color correction, but color grading. Now, understand that there's a difference between color correction and color grading. Color correction is taking footage, a series of footage, different shots, and making them appear as if they came from the same camera in the same location, correcting the color so that all of them are uniform. Color grading is the overall grade that you want to place on the overall sequence of shots. So these are color grading presets. You may like these, you might hate them. It doesn't really matter. I'm giving this to you for free, and you can feel welcome to change it any way that you want. In general, if you ever look at any color grading tutorials, you'll find that the general rule in color grading is to rather desaturate your image first a little bit, and then to add some colors at different points in the image. So the high colors, the lighter colors will be graded to a certain color, the mid-tones will be graded to a certain color, and then the low tones, the more blacks, will be graded to a certain color. Typically, you want your there to be 0 amount of black in absolute black in your image, and 0 amount of absolute white in your image, so that your white should never be at 100 and your black should never be at 0. So I've done that for all of these settings, plus I've added some different color grading. You can take a look at what's happening here. If I click on the first one, Contemporary Grade, and I hit Tab, you'll see the node setup inside here. So I have a desaturation cut the saturation down. Then I use an RGB curves adjustment. So this is the basic color. You can see that the bottom end is not absolutely at 0. The top end is not absolutely at 1. It's slightly off, and then I have a little bit of a contrast set in here. Then you see in the blue channel, there's blue is increased on the low end, decreased on the top. The red is increased on the top, decreased on the low end. The green is increased a little bit more in the center. And this is kind of what I think is more of a classic, contemporary, not classic, but a contemporary sort of grading scheme. And I increase the saturation to kind of boost that grade that I've added to it before it comes to the output. So if I tab out of that, let's put this together and see what we can make of it. So first I'm going to use the medium vignette. So I'm going to take my original shot and I'm going to pipe it through my medium vignette. I'm then going to go from there, and we'll go to, let's go to the medium grain. And this is a little heavy, but I just want to make sure you can see it. Again, it's adding and subtracting some grain. And then we'll take this and we'll take it all the way up to the contemporary output. And then we're going to go from our contemporary grade down to our final output, and we'll see how this changes the image. So this is the new grade. And you can see that the darks are more blue, the lights are more red or orange, the opposite color spectrum from blue. The center is a little bit more green, a little bit more vibrant after the image was desaturated a little bit. And you can see some of this grain. This is very heavy. I'm using the medium setting, so it's a little more obvious. And if I play this back, you'll see how, especially in the dark parts, how this grain cycles through. You can see how the grain is changing with each frame. This is, you know, a method of compositing, and you can see how fast these things are occurring. Now, if I was using the Blender compositor to do distortion like this, and also to add grain effects and do some color grading, it would take several seconds for each frame in order to composite, but this is done very, very quickly using OpenGL. And then from here I can, if I have my output settings proper, I want to make sure I'm outputting to a video output, one of my video settings. You could also go to single frames if you're going to do an image sequence. And I want to also make sure that my frame rates and everything are set. I could then click on my OpenGL render output, and it will render out to a video file very quickly. If I render a single image, you'll see how fast this works. I click on the single frame, and about a second and a half later I've got my frame at my resolution. Now let me just quickly show you some of these settings here very quickly, just so you can see what kind of color grading options are available to you. I'm just going to leave my vignette and my film grain the way it is. Let's say I go to the next one, which is labeled 21st century. This one I was going for more of an 80s through 90s film look, which is a little bit lower saturation, a little less contrast. The next one I have on here is, I'll grab this and move it down to, I called this Action Hero, which is going to be more highly saturated, very high saturation on the output. And you can see how saturated this is. The reds are the color is very, very vibrant. You can see that film grain in there. The darks are very blue. Again, there is no absolute black. That's very important. And no absolute white. If I go down to my next one here, I call this one TV, more television, which is again going to be somewhat vibrant in color, but a little desaturated. So you can see the oranges in there. So maybe a little bit more like a primetime television filmic look. The next one here is, and you might disagree with my interpretations. That's fine. I don't, it really doesn't matter. You can change these or create any more that you want. The next one here is called bleach bypass. So classic bleach bypass that you've seen, where it's very desaturated. The whites are really blown out and the darks are really contrasted, and you can see this film grain is still in there. The next one is War Zone, which is kind of another version of bleach bypass that I created. Looks more like perhaps a war movie, a little bit green, a little bit higher green in the midtones. I have another one on here called Evil Woods, and you might see what I'm getting at. There was a kind of a well-known movie that came out in the 90s. You may have seen the Blair Witch Project, which kind of looks like that film black and white that they were using. This works really well with the high heavy grain and the heavy vignetting. It looks really creepy. So there's a black and white setting. Again, you don't have to use all of these things. You can avoid the grain. You can skip the vignette, and you can go straight to these color grading presets and just use these, or you could just use the vignette or just use the film grain presets. This one's called Rabbit Hole, and you can probably see what I'm getting at with this. It's very, very green sort of output. Another one here is, I call it Tundra, which is like the frozen tundra, very cool kind of output. See, very blue. The next one I called Havana, as in Havana, Cuba, kind of more of a tropical reds color to it. If you're using, if your footage is supposed to be from a certain climate that is supposed to be warmer, you could use that one. This one's called Wild West, which is a little bit more of a sepia kind of color, more yellowy, very low contrast. There's really no black in there at all. Everything is very low contrast. Kind of a dry looking color. And the last one on here I called Day for Night. So if you're shooting day footage and you want to make it look more like at night, one rule, and I think this is fairly effective, one rule in Day for Night is you want to try to avoid shooting the sky so it's not so obvious. But if you were shooting footage and you wanted it to look like it was happening at nighttime or in the darker type atmosphere, I have a preset for that as well. So anyway, this is the package that I have for you to use. It's on Blendswap. Feel free to download it and alter it any way that you choose, and hopefully you find a good use for this. I may do some more tutorials in the near future, also discussing more of this concept of compositing using the OpenGL capabilities without going to the compositor, the Blender internal compositor, or using the video sequence editor, but doing some more compositing. You can actually do a lot more with mesh deformation, using mesh deform. You can use some of these modifiers to do some mesh deformation live. Some things that you would have to wait several seconds for in the compositor in terms of deforming and turbulent displacing images. You can actually do it very quickly in real time with a mesh right from the viewport here using GLSL shading and OpenGL rendering. You can do heat distortion and all kinds of things. And even with some of those, particularly when you're using the modifiers, you can use the internal textures to do that because it's being applied as a modifier, a texture in the modifier rather than in the texture output render material texture slots. So those can be utilized in that way. Lots of power here that does not get used. I'm not sure too many people think of the viewport in this way, but for someone like me who has a low system resources and wants to get away with some bigger effects more quickly, this is a good way to go, I think, using the OpenGL capabilities in Blender and using some unorthodox methods in rendering. So anyway, this is the GLOptics pack. Feel free to download this at Blendswap and use it for any projects that you have. No need to give any credit back. I just hope that you find some good use for it. So again, this is Carl Irwin wishing all of you happy blending.